Welcome to GS Podcast number 139, the first podcast of May, and it's a belter. It really is. I'll be speaking to Professor Wilfred Reilly about his book, Hate Crime Hoax, how the left is selling a fake race war. Provocative much. More about that in a moment. First of all, just a few items to pick up. What are you playing at? What are you playing at? Yes, you. The person who's always listened to this show, the person who listens to it on the treadmill, the person who listens to it when they're washing their dishes, the person who has one earbud in at work listening to it whilst pretending they're getting on with stuff. You who enjoy this podcast and love it and never miss an episode and look forward to it. Why aren't you supporting me? What do I have to do? How many more amazing guests do I have to bring to you before you'll say, you know what, have $1 a month. Have $1 a month. Doesn't matter. Sorry, I just thought I'd try the tough love approach. I'm usually dead nice, like, support the show if you want, I don't mind, whatever. Or sometimes I just even forget to ask. So the basic situation is I work full time. I have a day job, which I'd very much like not to have. And I'm sure everyone feels the same. However, I am also producing something on the side in my spare time that gets thousands and thousands and thousands of listens. And a very, very small percentage of people chip in to support the show, which I understand. We're all like that. We all expect our content now and we all expect it for free. But just know if you really enjoy an independent content producer, they rely solely on your support usually. So anything you can offer up, either by sharing the show around as much as you can, by leaving a review on Stitcher or iTunes or wherever you're listening to it, or by helping out monetarily. And you can do the latter by visiting gspellchecker.com/support, and you can pledge to give as much as you want, as often as you want, and you can cancel at any time. And I probably won't come round to your house and start slapping you around if you cancel. Probably. More about my excellent guest. I really enjoyed this conversation. I read Wilfred Reilly's book a little while back, and he's someone who's centre-right, and the title of the book does imply an anti-left bias. So I was quite sceptical going in. I was very sceptical about what kind of message this book would push. And there are a few kind of jokes in there and jibes at the expense of liberals, nothing too inflammatory. But I was pleasantly surprised to see how diligent he was, how objective he was, how fair he was with the data. And the results of his research and what he puts forward in this book is quite staggering, really. So you'll hear a lot of the statistics in this podcast that are reiterated in his book, and a lot of them may come as a shock to you. You might think that can't possibly be true, and a quick Google search will confirm that it is. So then you're in the situation where you have to ask yourself why you were so convinced one particular narrative was accurate. Why you don't hear the flip side of the coin or any challenge to it. And it seems that our journalists and our media publications are failing us in this regard. So we get right into that and we talk about anything and everything all the way through hate crime, Black Lives Matter, the reaction to Trump, and just how widespread hate crime hoaxes are. Obviously, hate crime is real, hate crime happens, hate crime is horrendous when it does happen, and there can be no excuses. I won't hear excuses for that kind of thing. But this show's always delved in the alternative conversation, the conversation people aren't having. You're kind of trying to shine a light on the blind spots, if you will. There is no point in me doing a 90-minute episode where I nod along to somebody and we both agree for an hour that hate crime is bad and hate crime happens and hate crime should be prevented. We all largely agree on this. However, there's another conversation going on about hoaxes and misinformation and moral panic surrounding these things. So it's great to get into it with somebody who's qualified, someone who's passionate, someone who appears to have bags of charisma as well. So make sure you seek Wilfred out. I think he'd probably prefer you to find him on Facebook, so search for Wilfred Reilly there. He is also on Twitter. Not especially active on there, but you might help change that if you send some kind words, some follow-up questions, some love in his direction. You can find him at Will, with one L, underscore DA underscore beast 630. I changed that, Will. I'll be honest with you. I would call yourself something else, but, it's quite rich coming from Godless Spell Checker, isn't it? You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com, and you can help support the show by visiting gspellchecker.com/support. Enjoy.
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for you, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell checker from the God of Creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means. And he said, it goes H-E-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. H-E-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we know, just means we don't believe. And then he keeps telling them things he got to say. A reason shoppers at night will make them run away, but if they start that fight, well, they can go all day. Spell checker, he's a guy, spell checker. Now you know how it goes, so sing along with me. H-E-H-E-I-S-T, 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 H-E-H-E-I-S-T.
I'm very pleased to welcome author and Professor of Political Science and Intelligence, Wilfred Reilly, to the JS podcast. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Good to be here. I'd say God bless, but that's not really the thing to do here, I'm guessing.
We'll allow it. We'll allow it. But yeah, no, it's great to speak to you. I've read your new book from cover to cover, Hate Crime Hoax: How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Now it's really interesting to me because I've noticed the prominence of sort of fake hate crime hoaxes over the last few years, but nowhere near as many as you've managed to document in your book. And it's interesting as well that it seems to be coming from the left mainly, which is sort of my political tribe, if you will. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. But maybe you could just take a moment just to tell my listeners a little bit about your background. What is it you would say that you do?
I live and try to learn, to quote Buddha, but to be less of a pompous ass, I'm currently a professor of political science and also of counterintelligence and counterterrorism, which has been interesting, at Kentucky State University. That's, as you may suspect, an American state university, just received tenure here. By background, I am from Chicago. I was born on the south side of the city, grew up on the east side of nearby Aurora, moved back to the city later as a businessman. So that's my Heimat, the place I'm from. Broad range of educational institutions, also mostly in the U.S. Midwest. Attended Southern Illinois University, which was a lot of fun. University of Illinois, which wasn't, but gave me a good education. Northern Illinois, and so on down the line. Completed my PhD in 2015. Hate Crime Hoax is my second book. The first is called The $50 Million Question, an engagingly empirical look at valuation. So I look at the extent to which people value their race, their sex, their sexual orientation, their social class, religion, in the sense of being hypothetically willing to change those things. Those are the first two. My third book is called Taboo, which breaks down the things that you're not supposed to say about race and class on both right and left, especially in America. So that's a little bit of my writing and a little bit of my background.
Okay, great. So that's a few more books to add to my reading list. But I mean, I suppose it might be worth clearing up in case some of my listeners might get the wrong idea about this conversation. You go to great lengths in your book on hate crime to spell out the fact that hate crime does exist and it is a real problem and it's horrendous when it happens.
Of course. Yes. And I'm glad you made that point. There's a tendency, at least in the USA, I would suspect in Britain as well, I don't know in which of those countries you're based, but on left, on alt-right, when someone makes a point that you don't agree with, to say that that person is not merely mistaken, but evil. So, for example, if I were to say that, in fact, 75% of the males shot by police in America happen to be white or Hispanic, that doesn't mean that I'm detracting from occasional racist police shootings of blacks. It simply means that I'm saying that there are not as many as a sensationalist media presents there as being, and that ought to affect the logical, the cognitive way in which we analyze a risk, right? It's the same thing here. I mean, of course, there are real hate crimes. Jews, in particular, in both the States and Europe, have been attacked more in recent years than ever before in post-World War II sort of civilized history. So that is terrible when it happens. But at the same time, if it turns out that about 50% of all high-profile hate crimes or 80% of college campus hate crimes are fakes, that is going to affect the empirical analysis that you conduct when you see one of these stories in the paper. before you agree to something like a multicultural center on a college campus, for example, you would probably, as a result of a quote unquote wave of hate crimes, you would probably first want to verify that the hate crimes had actually happened, and very often they have not. So, yes, of course, I think we're all against crime. I think we're all against racism. The question in the science is how much of these things there is. I mean, in political science, we all accept that war is bad. The question is then, how often are wars fought and how can we prevent them? Just sitting around in a circle reiterating war is bad is not productive.
I mean, your book's very thorough. It's very data orientated. I think it's quite fair as well. I think there's instances in there which overwhelmingly seem like a hoax, but you can be quite reluctant to label it one because you don't have, 100% confirmation. So I just, maybe you could explain a little bit about the criteria that you use to categorize something as a hate crime hoax.
Well, sure. There was a very specific methodology. So a hate crime obviously is a bias-motivated criminal incident. So, for example, it can be motivated by a bias along racial lines of sexual orientation, sex itself, if, for example, you're attacking a feminist, so on down the line. American law is curious on this point in terms of what categories are protected in our Civil Rights Act and which are not. So, for example, an attack based on social class or political party would not be a hate crime in the United States, and I don't include those cases in my data set. But essentially, the cases in my data set are all incidences where there was a nationally or regionally reported allegation of hate crime. So you're talking about a national or regional media story claiming, one, that something had happened, and two, that it was an act of bias. And in about 93% of these cases, you also have a police report. So beyond the story, there's a claim that's been filed with law enforcement officers. That's point one. There's a hate crime. Point two is that it turns out to be a hoax, which I define as either it never occurred at all. People frequently, especially on the campus, will simply make up stories about, for example, a beating. Or two, it turned out to be committed by an individual or group of individuals very different from those that were originally suspected of it. So, for example, if a left-leaning African-American and his Jewish girlfriend turn out to be the people responsible for a series of swastikas painted on a public building, that is treated as a debunked hate crime, a hate crime hoax. And again, there you can argue with some of these definitions. My definitions are quite reasonable, but I believe Brian Levine, who's done some good work from the left in this arena, looks only at the percentage of cases that actually involved a police report and that were then referred to the prosecution, which turned out to be hoaxes. I have a broader definition, police report, publicity around the case, and then final point, I'm rambling a bit. There's another national or regional story debunking the case. It is turned out with considerable evidence to be a fake. That's what I consider to be a hate crime hoax. There's a widely publicized allegation of a hate crime that later turns out to be fake. And in my data set right now, concentrated really in the last 5 years, I've got 608 of those. So this is not uncommon.
Wow. Yeah, I think the idea of categorizing ones that have had a level of publicity is probably the smarter move, because obviously that has a greater cultural impact in a sense, doesn't it, if it's in the mainstream media arena. I mean, just to give my listeners an idea of the lengths people will go to orchestrate these kind of things, what's your go-to example of your cast iron go-to example of a hate crime hoax that you tend to provide people with?
Well, I mean, there are literally dozens of them. I mean, to answer your question directly, Jussie Smollett is the case that's given my book a degree of publicity it probably would not otherwise have had. I mean, within a week of my publication date for a major press book about hate crime hoaxes, a gentleman in my old neighborhood of my old city literally staged probably the biggest hate hoax of the past 5 years. So, I mean, sometimes there's unexpected luck that springs up from whatever direction, almost.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that your book was released just before the Jussie Smollett incident, wasn't it? I mean, was that a frustrating thing for you, or is that a good thing for you?
Obviously, in moral terms, as a citizen of the country who rather likes it, of course, you want there to be as few hate crimes and as few hate hoaxes as possible. As someone who used to be a sales executive, from a business perspective, it was a good thing, bluntly. I mean, sales spiked by about 1,000 the day after Jussie Smollett's allegations were revealed to be a hoax, at least according to Amazon. I believe there were 644 sales in that immediate period of the book. But that, I think, is the most ridiculous example of a hate hoax. This is a situation where a guy claimed that in one of Chicago's most liberal neighborhoods, called Streeterville, it's our young professional neighborhood, kind of middle-end condos, Neighborhood's probably 20% black, probably 15% gay, relevant in terms of demographics. He claimed that he was attacked by two white men wearing, I believe he said originally, patriotic ski masks. They were wearing those red Donald Trump MAGA hats. They were carrying a noose with them. They were carrying a gallon bottle of bleach with them. He said they recognized him immediately from his television show Empire about hip-hop music production, which is, I'm sure, obviously #1 among rural Trump supporters. You know, they attacked him, two big men. I've been in a scuffle or two myself. I mean, it seems unlikely that he then fought them off. He says he beat them both back with one hand. He was holding a Subway sandwich, ran away, managed to escape into his condo building, but he still had the sandwich in his hand. He had a noose around his neck. I mean, so the story itself was preposterous. One element that I will add to this, it gets cold in Chicago. So that particular day, we had what's called a winter vortex blizzard coming in off the Great Lakes. So it was -20. But he claimed that he was able to see the facial features of these people pretty clearly. They were both described as white men. So that's part one. It later turned out that he had paid two of his buddies from the gym, who were Nigerian semi-professional bodybuilders, to beat him up. And he'd then paid them with a personal check for the exact amount of the beating. And all this came out, of course, when the case was exposed as a hoax. But that, I would say, is probably the most ludicrous example. But there are many that come close to that. I mean, about a week before Jussie Smollett, you saw Covington Catholic, where the claim was that this group of young, mostly white prep school men had surrounded a literal Native American Indian elder who was sort of just walking by. They had chanted "Build the Wall," which is a damned ironic thing to say to an Indian. They had threatened to take his tribe's sacred rain drum away. This was revealed as a complete lie. The white guys, a group of black Hebrew Israelites, and a group of native men had just been yelling at each other. Nothing happened at all. Yasmin Suweed, the claim that in broad daylight on the New York 6 train, she was attacked by a crowd of blonde Trump supporters that tore at her hijab. A bunch of these cases, Air Force Academy, where the claim was that there was so much racial hostility on the campus of one of our service academies that a general, Jay Silveria, had to come down and speak against racism. It turned out that one or a few disgruntled black cadets were responsible for all of the incidents. And you can go back through recent history with these. At Duke lacrosse, where the claim was that a entire athletic team, a lacrosse franchise, had sexually abused a stripper. Tawana Brawley, where a woman claimed to have been kidnapped and abused by a group of people that included a cop in uniform, and the New York City District Attorney, Steve Pagones. So, I mean, there's no shortage of ridiculous examples when I'm doing something like speaking at a dinner. There are, without making too much light of this, quite a few of these cases, and many of them, frankly, are funny.
Yeah, I mean, the Jussie Smollett one sounds like something you'd write for a sketch, doesn't it? I mean, looking at the Covington schoolboys one, we were fortunate enough to live in an age now where we all have smartphones and things can be instantly documented, and that situation was very quickly pieced together, almost second by second, and the whole world could then see that these young boys from this Catholic school were guilty of absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, the way they behaved was quite impeccable given the situation they were in. So we had this fully revealed picture, yet many of the liberal commentators and news outlets still wasn't willing to accept the reality of the situation. So what's happening there when we have a completely second by second documentation of what did occur, yet we have commentators and news outlets that are still unwilling to say that these boys were innocent?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. That was a fascinating case in that online internet culture, whether you're talking about 4chan on quote unquote the right or Atlanta Black Star on quote unquote the left, pieced together the real story within hours. So the black Hebrew Israelites, who weren't necessarily ashamed of their behavior either, they had essentially just thought they'd made some good jokes. At one point, they said the Covington March looked like a school shooter convention. They posted a video of the three groups arguing to YouTube. They thought of this, again, as people exchanging good jokes. They didn't think it was a big deal. It's still up. It has about 1,000 comments. But internet culture and just ordinary young people sitting at computer terminals or in bars were very aware within an hour of what had happened. And you're absolutely right. The media presentation of this, which went on for days, which included very serious articles about whether wearing a red hat or making the 3-point sign with 3 fingers in the air at a sporting event is evidence of racism. The media conversation existed on a completely different parallel trajectory from reality, if I can put it that way. And that is not infrequent. I think that in general, in life, everyone has a narrative. For example, I believe that I am still a very attractive, athletic human being as I get past the 35 mark. This is probably, empirically speaking, not true. Narratives become problematic when people in power positions all share one narrative. I would say in the American mainstream media, the center-left mass media, there are a couple of troubling biases. One is towards sensationalism, which is rarely discussed at all. But there's a tendency to report stories, whether or not they are of major national importance, that shock people and get them to keep watching or click on the ad underneath the story's banner headline. So some examples of this would include animal attack, terrorism, any example of interracial conflict initiated by either side, men's sexual and erectile problems to judge from the stories and the ads, so on down the line. Another problem, though, is liberal bias in a definable sense of that term. So in 2004, the Pew Research Foundation, obviously impeccable reputation, centrist organization, conducted a major study of national mass media journalists, television and print. And they found that about 93% of them were either liberals or left-leaning moderates. And they found that a very, very disproportionate percentage of them lived in a few coastal enclaves, New York, San Francisco. Chicago is considered kind of a backwater hinterland with our mere 12 million people. So they found these biases, and I think you see these biases reflected in coverage at the national level very, very often. In the case of any coverage of race issues, there seems to be a slant toward the narrative that, quote unquote, heartland Americans are fairly bad and that the United States is still a very racist, oppressive country. So one of the things I've researched is originally beginning as a sympathizer, is the Black Lives Matter narrative of police violence, where if you read the platform of the Movement for Black Lives, they explicitly say that, quote, tens of thousands of young black men, innocents, essentially each year are killed by police. It turns out this is a fantasy. In the typical year I use for evaluation in Hoax, 2015, there were 1,200 people of all races killed by on-duty police officers. Of those, only 258 were black. It turns out that the total number of unarmed black men, 1, shot specifically by white officers, 2, in that representative year was 17. It is true that the black percentage of shooting victims, which is 22.5%, was higher than the percentage of blacks in the population overall, which is 13 to 14%. But that gap, about a 10% gap, closes entirely if you adjust for the black crime rate, which is slightly but definitely higher than the white crime rate. So there's no story there at all, but you nonetheless saw the mainstream mass media promote the idea that there was for several years. There were millions of Google hits for Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, so on, and essentially none for the 78% of police shooting victims who happen to be white or Hispanic or of foreign origin. So I think you saw a similar example of evidence of bias, perhaps, in the Covington Catholic situation, where you had an almost ideal case. I mean, these were all white kids, all upper middle class kids. They were presumably religious, at least conventionally religious. They had literally been coming back from the March for Life, I believe it's called, in Washington. So this was an archetypal example of the narrative of prejudice in our society. But considering that our society is no longer crippled by prejudice, like many of these narratives, it proved to be false.
Yeah, I mean, I think there may be something to say for the iconography here, so the Make America Great Again hat. Now, for someone who lives in England, as an outsider looking in, to me that represents support for the President of the United States, which just happens to be Donald Trump. That's his campaign slogan, that's what he runs with. My initial thoughts up front whenever I see someone wearing a MAGA hat is that's a Trump supporter. I don't instantly think white supremacist or fascist. And now, I'm guessing in the Venn diagram of voters for Trump. They may, you're going to find some white supremacists in there, perhaps some fascist, of course. But I think it's a quite uncharitable assumption to make up front. And this is coming from someone who's quite anti-Trump. I'm a sort of a left-leaning liberal, but there seems to be something going on, and I've seen it termed Trump derangement syndrome in America. But there just seems to be people who are on the left, or so-called liberals in the United States, who just can't deal with the idea that somebody might have good intentions and support Donald Trump, which is a very dangerous situation if you're somebody who wants change in the White House. You want Donald Trump out. You have to converse with people and change their mind. So what impacts has Donald Trump's rise to the White House had on this sort of thing?
Well, I think Donald Trump's rise to the White House has definitely made the national conversation in the states even more frenzied and partisan. Yeah. And I mean, to a certain extent, you're obviously right. I mean, if we want to be blunt, it is more likely if someone is a racist with right-leaning political proclivities, it is probable that they're more likely to vote for Donald Trump than, say, for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, sure.
Similarly, you could say that if someone is an actual communist who favors the Russian or late Venezuelan model, they would be more likely to vote for Bernie Sanders than for Mr. Trump. That doesn't mean that Mr. Trump is a fascist or that most of his followers are, however, just as Bernie Sanders is probably not a Maoist and most of his followers aren't either. So I think what you've seen with Donald Trump is the exacerbation of what I just referred to in that last conversation about the Covington Catholic kids. One of the prevailing narratives in the states, and in fact, a narrative that entire sectors of our economy are based upon, affirmative action, minority set-asides, the budgets for the massive activist groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center has a well-invested endowment of, last I looked, $432 million, which is a bit more than my university. The baseline reason for all of that is that the idea that the United States in 2019 remains an extraordinarily racist, biased, prejudiced country. The problem is that empirically, when center-right quantitative researchers take a look at this, and this has been true since Tom Sowell in the 80s, there's not a whole hell of a lot of evidence for that. So, I mean, in the USA, we desegregated in 1954. By that point, segregation outside of perhaps residential neighborhoods was primarily a problem in the Deep South. Racism was made actually civilly and criminally illegal via the Civil Rights Act of 1965. We've actually been practicing positive discrimination in favor of minorities since 1967. So, in fact, if you take an empirical look at the question of how much bigotry a black or Asian individual with the same qualifications as the average white individual would encounter, the answer seems to be not much, 2 or 3%. But there's an entire sector of society, and I don't think this is conspiratorial, it's just a fact, founded on the idea that the reality is very different, that prejudice is constant. So that's an ongoing debate where people attempt to demonstrate bias in virtually everything, the SAT, Major League Baseball, and other people counter them by pointing out that the actual figures don't necessarily confirm their case. I think that the election of Donald Trump accelerated this race debate to previously unseen levels, where people that were used to claiming virtually everyone on the other side as a racist were faced with someone who actually from time to time did say dissident or controversial things, and there was just a frenzy. I mean, if you Google 2016 reaction to Trump, you'll see these images of people on all fours screaming at the sky. I mean, so the American left frequently described, for example, Mitt Romney as a hardcore racist. Mitt Romney, of course, is as so far as anyone knows, unprejudiced founder of Bain Capital, about as mainstream milquetoast businessman as you could find. To some extent, what's known as a rhino, Republican in name only. He actually, in Massachusetts, drew up the blueprint for what became Obamacare. He called it Romney Care. Romney was regularly described by individuals like Joe Biden as an extremist bigot. At one point, Biden, speaking to a large black audience, said, y'all know he's going to put y'all back in chains, right? About Mr. Romney. Wow. So I think that this had just been part of the American conversation for a while. Even in the absence of much evidence, much of the left continued to insist on the permanence of racism, using terms like white privilege, cultural appropriation. And when Trump came on the scene and said things like, quote unquote, Haiti is a bit of a shithole as a country, he described neo-Nazis and Antifa fighters beating each other up as very bad people, both sides. When he said that, it prompted a frenzy because here at least there was potential evidence of some kind of bigotry. And I think a lot of people were surprised by that at first, almost didn't know how to handle it, and then reacted with just extreme exponential anger. And that's what you're seeing now to some extent.
So given the hysteria of the left, and they seem to, I mean, this kind of behaviour, he's throwing around the terms of racist and white supremacist and pointing the finger at anyone who had a different opinion. They were, prominent, as you said, before the rise of Trump, and they've just been exacerbated. They seem to have doubled down, in a sense. So given that's happened, what's the chances of a second term for Donald Trump, would you say?
I think they're fairly high. That depends on the approach that the Democratic Party takes. So one potentially effective approach for the Democrats could be to present themselves as a return to normalcy. Donald Trump, in practice, has governed as a fairly standard center-right president. People often seem shocked when I say that, but it's simply a fact. He's done things like pass the standard tax cut for rich Americans that first-term Republicans do. He's handled issues like the movement of the Israeli embassy, actually, with some grace in a number of cases. But nonetheless, he has done things that typical politicians and political candidates have not. He's been implicated in unprotected sexual affairs with porn stars. He's been accused of attempting to build buildings representing his corporation in Russia. He's been accused, although not very convincingly, of colluding with the Russians. He's said the things he did about Haiti, about Charlottesville, about Mexican immigrants. So I think that the Democrats could certainly respond to that by saying we need a mature adult in the White House. It's time to take away the president's toys. Vote Biden-Harris, for example.
Yeah.
Joe Biden was the popular, fairly moderate vice president under Barack Obama for 8 years. Harris was a successful prosecutor in California. I'm trying to put the words together here coherently, though. I don't think the Democrats are going to do that. So I do think it's very likely Trump wins. The Democrats have not yet figured out that there's a distinction between their very loud, very woke Twitter base, maybe 1 in 5 members of which is a real person rather than a Hootsuite multiple account, that there's a distinction between this and the people that actually vote for them. So if you look at the Democratic primary, there seems to be a contest to propose more and more frenzied far-left solutions. So Bernie Sanders, for example, recently proposed letting people who are currently incarcerated vote. And he was asked in one of those kind of Dukakis in a tank moments, does that mean that you'd let the Boston Marathon bomber vote? And he said, well, yes, of course, he did a bad thing, but you shouldn't take his franchise away.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it was unbelievable that he at least didn't dodge the question more effectively. But, I mean, you've seen other candidates propose letting people vote at 16. I believe that may have been Harris, in fact. Yeah. Letting undocumented, illegal, bluntly immigrants vote in local elections. But beyond that, I mean, Elizabeth Warren has proposed reparations. I think that if the Democrats compete to be the wokest possible people, anyone running against Trump saying this stuff that sounds to many people like anti-science nonsense, the most feminist religion is Islam, reparations tomorrow, IQ is not real. The more the Democrats double down on the left-wing creationism, the more likely they are to lose. Hijabs are feminist, this sort of thing. Illegal immigrants from urban Mexico or refugees. Many people see these comments as just nonsensical, and in most cases they are.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that's a very interesting point about the online woke brigade, and a very few of them ideas are liked or even adhered to by the population at large. People just seem to be more interested in security, economy, jobs, things like that, rather than whether or not the new Marvel movie's got a statistically significant number of gay people in it, for instance. So that is interesting. I mean, just to circle back about Jussie Smollett, one of the things that's quite confusing to that, especially people across the pond as well, our laws are different on this, but he was found with his hand in the cookie jar, essentially. He had evidence that he'd staged this entire affair. The chief police of Chicago gave a really strong and quite moving public statement about it. They called a press conference, and then there seems to have been some sort of deal done afterwards, and he's walked free from what I can see. Maybe you could explain to my listeners what exactly happened there.
I think, saying this in the legally non-slanderous sense of the term, that the fix was in. So in this case, just to clarify the evidence, there is no chance, speaking again as someone aware of the libel and slander laws, that Mr. Smollett, Jussie, was innocent. In this case, there was literally a video of the two Nigerian brothers involved in the matter, the Osundario brothers, buying rid hats, ski masks, and lengths of rope at a local Home Depot a few days before the assault. And this isn't me making a claim as, center-right political commentator blathering online. You can literally find that by Googling the term "video shows brothers linked to Smollett attack buying all items." That's from national CBS. It's still live on YouTube. As I recall, the police said that the brothers used a sort of shopping list put together by Smollett in order to do this. So they very likely have a copy of that. The brothers themselves have signed written confessions to the police saying that they beat Smollett up upon his request. They say that he paid the brothers to attack him, and in fact, they have a signed check from him for the exact cost of the attack. I think a second level of this, speaking as someone with legal training, is that this was not an acquittal in any sense. Smollett still had to pay at least $10,000 to Chicago. He forfeited his entire bond amount. He was either given credit for pretty substantial community service, 18 hours, or assigned further community service. My notes are a little vague about that. The exact technique used to terminate the case was not an acquittal, not even a dismissal. It's a nolle prosequi, which is a sort of technical removal of the case from the criminal justice system that's often used with guilty defendants. The prosecutor who oversaw the case, who came out and had to serve as sort of a whipping boy for Kim Foxx's office when the dropping of charges was declared, he said that he personally, Maggots, I believe, he personally did not believe that Smollett was innocent. As you mentioned, the Chicago police superintendent, Eddie Johnson, the mayor of the city, Rahm Emanuel, came out and gave these quite moving speeches for these hardened public figures where they said that they were furious. They thought Smollett was guilty. So, I mean, in essence, this was a miscarriage of justice that benefited a very rich guy. And the shot caller on that, the string puller, seems to have been the Cook County District Attorney, Kim Foxx. And more almost unbelievable details have come out about this since the charges were themselves dropped. Apparently, Kim Foxx was in contact with members of Smollett's family. You don't want to come up with fanciful conspiracy theories here, but at least once she was in contact with Michelle Obama's chief of staff, apparently, who urged some sort of leniency in this matter. So it strikes me that Jussie Smollett had the most important advantage you can have if you're involved in a criminal legal trial, not race or anything of that sort. He was rich, and he had people in positions to contact the prosecutor. And as a result, very little happened to him. But, I mean, when you have YouTube videos of people preparing for the attack, we can say he was not innocent.
So even if he's managed to dodge some sort of legal repercussions, do you think the court of public opinion has judged him sufficiently? Do you think he'll struggle to make headway in the sort of music industry or the entertainment industry now?
You never know. My immediate assumption would be that his career is over. When we were talking about the difference between kind of the woke mobs on Twitter and real people in society, I think that many people who are just ordinary citizens in the States and indeed in Europe have begun to view many of the claims of the activist left as essentially creationist in scope or in validity. And I mean, a short list of those might include, again, the police are killing thousands of innocent black men per year. The country is rife with white on black crime. There is a wave of brutal hate crimes. Illegal immigrants are refugees. All cultures are equal. So on down the line. Hijabs are feminist is probably my favorite. Men and women can effortlessly change sex, one becoming the other. I don't think that most people believe these things. If you were to go down to the football field or the golf course near my campus and just talk to a group of guys, I would assume 95% of them would say, well, of course, Jussie Smollett was guilty. And that would be true across all races, as it was to some extent with O.J. Simpson. So you would assume that he's not going to go very far in show business after this, but you never know. Show business is dominated by the sort of woke leftists who are very represented on Twitter. So I wouldn't be entirely surprised to see Jussie Smollett attempt to rehab his reputation in a year or two. do some charitable work and then start appearing on shows describing how he was motivated to do what he did by something sympathetic, a drug addiction maybe, or just an awareness of how racist America was, something like that.
Yeah, you can almost see the headlines, can't you? Even if Jussie Smollett's attack didn't happen, many more do, and this shone a light on the reality of America's dark underbelly or something. But, I mean, it's something interesting about the consequences of these fake hate attacks as well, because they only seem to hurt the people who are genuinely affected. In a sense, I don't know if you. Actually, this might tie it back to the Southern Poverty Law Centre. There's a Muslim activist and anti-extremist in the UK called Majid Nawaz. I don't know if you've heard of him. He does some great work. Very staunch man of principles. Self-identifies as a liberal, which is, I think, probably closer to a libertarian in American parlance. He was actually genuinely attacked in a racial attack either the day after Jussie Smollett or a couple of days after, and there were a lot of chatter online of people incredibly reluctant to believe him solely because of the claims of Jussie Smollett. So it can have that kind of negative effect as well, can't it?
Yes, obviously. I don't know if this is one where we'll banter back and forth for a while, because your point is correct and it's unfortunate. If you look at any cases of this kind, whether you're talking about fake reports of sexual assault, which are also, unfortunately, very common on the campus. There's actually a book about this, The Campus Rape Frenzy, that's right of center, but very solidly statistically sourced. If you look at that, if you look at fake hate incidents, arsons that are initially attributed to some sort of outgroup, once those things are exposed as fakes, the people most hurt are the people that have been harmed by similar real versions of that crime. I actually thought about that ethically before writing Hoax. But the simple fact is you're not talking about 2 or 3 hoaxes. You're talking about, I say at minimum, between 15 and 50% of at least widely reported hate incidents turning out to be fake. So when you have an epidemic on that scale, you do need to describe it. But obviously, that reality, or even pointing out that reality, can have a harmful impact on people who actually have suffered. Yes, we do need to consider that.
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of Jussie Smollett, one of the reasons speculated for his hoax was that he was trying to get a bigger salary on his TV show. And I was just wondering, what are some of the other reasons that people orchestrate these things? How do they benefit by lying and getting mass media attention based on a lie?
Well, I think there are 2 levels there. First, at the individual level, hate hoaxers seem to have the same sort of tawdry, basic motivations that most people do when they commit crimes. Obviously, the primary motivation for crime is money. I believe it was either Jesse James or Billy the Kid very famously said when he was asked why he robbed banks, that's where the money is. So
That's great.
You frequently see something. A case that comes to mind would be Continental Spices Cash and Carry. This was a well-known Arab-American-owned business in Everett, Washington that specialized in Persian and Indian foods. And the store burnt to the ground, and throughout the charred husk of the building were written these horribly offensive messages like, Arab, go home. And the immediate assumption was that this had been a hate attack. The insurance company, as I understand the auditing process, went a bit easier on the guy than they normally would have. And later, through this very complex example of fairly solid police work, it was discovered that he set the fire himself. He had fallen behind paying the note on the business. He thought he might lose the business. So that might be a typical individual level motivation. And there are other similar motivations for most crime, including hate hoax. Notoriety locally, perhaps sex or romance, and the woke campus of today, just as sex might be a motivation for perhaps prostitution, sexual assault, some other things. So the motivations of hate hoaxers seem to be very similar to the motivations of most criminals, which is to say, I want to draw attention to myself or get money for myself. I think that what really is interesting, though, is the motivation of the individuals that make these cases into national stories. So one of the things that I've said when interviewed on television and so on is that there is no secret that there exists a very well-funded, entrenched grievance industry in the USA. I don't know if this is true to quite the same extent in Britain. But here, for example, we have the traditional civil rights groups like Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, Al Sharpton's National Action Network, Southern Poverty Law Center, Anti-Defamation League, you might put in this category. But all of those, I'm positive have budgets in the 8 to 9 figures. As I've mentioned, SPLC's endowment is $432 million. I believe ADL's is $144 million. You have new contenders on the scene. The Occupy movement, which has produced sites like Occupy Democrats, Black Lives Matter, which recently crossed the 500,000 threshold in terms of social media followers and potential givers. You have the large fringe groups like the Nation of Islam, which claims 50,000 members, has an accredited university, Muhammad University, unbelievably. So when one of these cases comes to mind or comes to light again, the entire raison d'etre for these groups is that the United States of America is still filled with extreme racial conflict. And as we've explored, looking at that period from 1954 to 69, that's not really the case. So I do think that there is a strategic desire when evidence of racism does seem to appear or of other conflict to promote it as much as possible as a fundraising tool or even just as an indication that there's a reason for the lights to stay on. Why still have the NAACP at the level of a $500 million organization? Well, Mike Brown, that's why. Trayvon Martin, that's why. So I think that people individually very often falsify hate incidents because they want to attract attention on campus or get a few tens of thousands of dollars. But I think that the reason there is a national firestorm of media around almost every one of these cases is that they fit a pre-existing narrative.
Yeah, and that's obviously on a larger scale in the States, but that rings true of the UK too, unfortunately. We have a lot of special interest groups now that, some have actually been caught red-handed just completely fudging the data to make it seem that, hate crime is expanding beyond, all belief. And the way we classify a hate incident, it's called in the UK, would probably make your head explode. You could, for instance, I can, if I claim that I've been the victim of a hate crime, even if there's no evidence to substantiate it, and it's likely that it wasn't a hate crime, it still gets logged as a hate crime. That goes into the statistics, which special interest groups pounce on and try and make themselves seem relevant and use these statistics for more funding and to get a seat at the table in the government. But with you sort of identify as centre right, so. Typically, those on the centre right don't care much for identity politics, and I think you notice this grievance industry, and you have issues with the claims made by Black Lives Matter. But you're doing this in the context of being a black man as well, and a lot of the time, the grievance industry claim to be for the black person, the black individual, to represent you and your voice. Black Lives Matter would certainly say that. So I'm just kind of wondering what sort of reaction do you get as somebody who almost seems like an outsider in that sense. People expect you, especially the left, I would imagine, to fall in line and accept sort of the woke, social justice warriors and groups like Black Lives Matter.
Well, I think there are two answers to that. First of all, in the online land of make-believe that is social media, I get a range of shouting, angry, profane messages. I've had a few death threats.
Wow.
In reality, as a big guy who actually is a professional pistol instructor and professor of counterterrorism, nothing but handshakes, really. So I think it's very important to distinguish between social media and reality. I've said this over and over again during the interview. Social media is the land of make-believe. I think that there's a comparison. When I was a younger man, I used to watch fake professional wrestling, which is a big, unbelievably large industry here in the USA.
Yeah.
And people on Twitter frequently remind me of wrestlers who are handled a microphone at SmackDown or Raw or something like that. The idea is you're surrounded by tens of thousands of people you don't know very well. How can you draw attention to yourself? What's the most radical, ridiculous thing you can say? So on social media, I'm fully prepared to engage that. I'm Wilfred Reilly on Facebook. I'm Will_BEEST 630 Will the Beast on Twitter. Multiple thousands of followers. My preferred platform is Facebook. So you get a lot of debate. In reality, I'm an upper middle class citizen politely disagreeing with the conventional narrative. No one does anything. Most people are friendly and even cowardly in person, I find. I'm sure I am myself, meeting someone for the first time at a dinner party. I will say that identity politics, I'm an American civic nationalist. And like most political scientists in the USA, it was nearly obligatory for me during graduate studies to look at the fall of the USSR and of Yugoslavia, which were sort of the ancient enemy for us for 50 years or so. And you see, reviewing what happened there, how easily it is for tribal and linguistic relations to topple a major state into a clump of little republics with names like the Republic of You and Me, and I'm not sure about me. I'd rather not see that happen here. I'm not a big fan of African American or Hispanic American identity politics. Many of those categories, like Hispanic American, by the way, are just jumbles made up of a variety of different things. No soy fluente, pero yo sé habla español bastante bueno por americano. Just saying that anyone who is Spanish speaking has a shared collective interest with everyone else that is Spanish speaking is nonsense of the first order. But at any rate, I oppose that. I also oppose the rising sort of working man's white identity politics you now see on the alt-right. That's just as bad or worse. None of that has anything to offer in a modern polyglot society like the USA or the USSR, except the destruction of that society. I don't think Black Lives Matter speaks for me as a black businessman. I think, in fact, many of their solutions, like pulling police out of working class black neighborhoods, would cause the deaths of a fairly large number of black people. If I can say one other thing here, by the way, when you mentioned the playing with statistics that goes on in the British public sector, this is true here as well. This is definitely true in the arena of hate crimes. I don't think we do this any better. And it's just very easy to lie with numbers. So, for example, a statistic you'll hear if you do any reading in the U.S. press about this issue at all is that hate crimes have jumped by 17% under Mr. Trump. It's called the Trump surge. There's been a 17% increase in hate crimes. The problem with this is that, and this is almost never reported, more than 1,000 new police departments started reporting their hate crime statistics to the FBI, who they've been squabbling with for decades, in 2016. That is responsible for probably 80+% of that surge. So it's very easy to play these games with numbers. Here as well, a reported hate crime is simply one reported to the police. So the conviction rate in a number of these categories of controversial crime is remarkably low. Extending California numbers to the entire USA, for example, in 2016, there were 931 reported felony or a misdemeanor hate incidents in California. However, only 220 of those were even referred to the prosecution, which is just the most basic standard in a legal case. That means you have any kind of suspect, he's breathing and he has a head, and you know the case wasn't a hoax. And of those cases, only 51 produced a conviction. So you're talking about, in the most liberal state in one of the world's larger nation states, a 6% rate of conviction in this area of crime we hear so much about. So here as well, I mean, you can play with data and make it say whatever you want. I guess my goal is to make it say what happens to also be true.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. I suppose there's two things. I mean, the first thing I want to ask is, you mentioned the statistics there and the fact that the media doesn't present them in the correct way or the most objective way or the way that's, most accurate. And you mentioned throughout your book as well that the follow-up stories of debunked hate crimes do not feature as prominently as the hate crimes themselves or to the same extent. And so what's going on here when the media, mainstream media, I don't want to homogenize the media as some sort of all-powerful force, but there just seem to be a narrative or a reluctance to follow things up objectively.
Yes, I think, and we've both summarized this pretty well throughout the conversation. To condense it a bit more, since we've had some time to think, I think the media leans towards sensationalism. I think they lean left. And as a result of those two factor variables combining, I think that a great many narratives, epidemic violence between white and black, the murdering, quote unquote, of young black men by police officers, surge of hate crimes, and a bunch of things that aren't even related to race, young child kidnapping, these false narratives are promoted by the media. Now, since the media is the entity or the set of entities promoting the false narrative, what you very much do find is that when a particular case is debunked, that is often relegated to page 26 of the leisure and pet cat section of the paper. So, I mean, you'll see a case. This happens very, very frequently. You'll see something like the Michael Brown case lead the New York Times for 9 days in a row, when it's revealed that Michael Brown, although a young man, was 6'5", weighed 290 pounds, and had his hands on the officer's gun, that very often, the Times did not bury it as much as they could have, but that's going to be a page 4 story. That's going to be a 1-column story. So you definitely see the construction of the storyline. We talked about social media censorship briefly before we both went in, and this is true even of what the search results are. Recently, as part of fairly grading a student paper, I had cause to Google the phrase black crime rate pretty high. Or very high, sorry, don't want to mislead. But on Google, almost every one of the first 100 results was to sort of these saccharine reports, FBI's official crime data, the Root claiming that black crime is not in fact high. If you went on Bing, Dogpile, any more serious research search engine, the first 10 hits were to mainstream conservative sites, Daily Wire, City Journal, National Review, The Economist, probably center right there, but actually breaking down what the statistics were. So nowadays, at the level of the combined print tech entity, Amazon, Washington Post, you can not only control what stories people see in your paper, you can control what stories people see when they pursue the stories in your paper. And I think that absolutely is done.
I mean, is there a thirst for villains or a thirst for some sort of big fight in a sense? Because one of the things I noticed in recent years on the in the left-leaning circles that I swim in, an absolute obsession with Nazis, as if Nazis were the big issue of the day, as if they're crossing the border, as if we're sort of in the 40s again. And these Nazis seem like spectres to me, and people seem to struggle to actually find them. We saw the big punch a Nazi hysteria, and very few Nazis have been punched in, so I kind of think that campaign lacked a little bit of sincerity. But so what's happening here when Nazis are on the agenda again for the left?
Well, I think that everyone always fights the last war. When I do teach classes that are essentially military science courses, that's one of the 5 or 6 axioms, along with when on death ground fight and so on, that we begin with. And I mean, to show my amateurish understanding of European history here, this is my understanding of what happened to begin World War II. The French and the Belgians and so on had prepared these massive fortified trench walls that would have served them well in World War I. But the Germans had developed better tanks, and they just went around or through them in a matter of days and conquered most of Central Europe. That portion of the war was over in 7 weeks. The point here is that once you've developed an ideology, and once you've devoted a great deal of your life to that ideology, you are not about to let go of that ideology without often literally a fight. In the United States, one of the defining realities of our discourse is that we had a cultural civil war perhaps 60 or 70 years ago. Many of our intellectual leaders, from Morris Dees at the Southern Poverty Law Center to Martin Luther King III, were literally involved in it. So these ideas that came out of that, the Ku Klux Klan is extraordinarily dangerous. Americans are a remarkably racist bunch. Even the stuff on the right about epidemic black crime, all of that dates back to this conflict that we had in a certain year X. Now, it may very well be the case, in fact, empirically it is the case, that after 52 years of affirmative action, many of the things claimed by the left are simply no longer true. But that doesn't mean that they have gotten out of the bones and blood of the people saying them yet. And I would imagine it's the same thing with the description of quote unquote literal Nazis in Europe. The problem with these sort of false narratives is that they are, one, based upon unreal claims. I would say in the United States, the equivalent of Nazi would be Ku Klux Klansman.
Yeah.
And virtually every year, like clockwork, usually in early fall, the Times, a paper I still subscribe to, it has its good days, but the Times will run an article called Klan is Rising Again. I guarantee you, if you Google this today, you'll find a 2018 headline from either the Times or the Post with a banner that says something like Ku Klux Klan growing, Ku Klux Klan displaying resurgence, something like that. And this is because that is the boogeyman in our national narrative, as Nazis might be in the French national narrative or something like that, fascists might be. The problem with this is that there are very few Klansmen. If you look at the membership rolls of every chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, according to not just the SPLC, but legitimate center-right and mainstream research institutions, there are about 9,000 Klansmen in the entire country. In comparison, there are 50,000 members of the Nation of Islam. Members of the Ku Klux Klan tend to be behind the curve in terms of SES or social class, IQ, income, location. They're very rarely power brokers in big cities. I would assume that the exact same thing is true of something like the frontline actual fighters for the National Front or actual members of a National Socialist Party in Europe. So the boogeyman is there just because people remember it from the past, but the boogeyman is no longer an actual threat. It is simply being presented as one. The problem with this is that focusing on ghosts and hobgoblins distracts from real problems. There are actual issues in the black and poor white community in the USA, gang violence, opiates, the absence of fathers, no dads in the home, that a concerted social effort could fix, which would have an amazing effect on many of both the black and quote-unquote hillbilly young individuals I see in Kentucky. But the more time we spend talking about imaginary threats, the less time we have to do that.
Yeah, no, that was very eloquently put. You just reminded me there with mentioning the Nation of Islam. Unless I've completely misinterpreted part of your book, I think you suggest that individuals from the Muslim community are disproportionately represented in hate crime hoaxes. Is that correct? Have I read that right?
That is exceptionally correct. I don't have the exact stats in front of me, and as we discussed, I don't like fudging or making up numbers. But as I recall, Muslim Americans were something like 40 times as likely as white Americans and 12 to 15 times as likely as black Americans, proportionally, to falsify hate incidents. So in my data set of 600 cases, something like 100 of them involve a Muslim false reporter or hoaxer. This is true both for insurance fraud cases and for sort of genuinely fake woke cases where someone, Yasmin Saweed, for example, claimed to have been attacked by a crowd or claimed to have taken a beating. I really have no idea why this is. I did not expect Muslims to be more likely to hoax than blue-haired white liberals or urban African Americans or, a number of other groups, but they were.
Yeah, it's always a tell, that blue hair, isn't it?
Well, generally, yeah, if you see someone with a short page boy cut of blue hair who happens to be a woman, they're probably not on the business right.
Wilfred, this has flown by and I've really enjoyed speaking to you. You obviously know your stuff and I really enjoyed your book, so I've been recommending it to people who are quite interested in this topic. So I just want to thank you for your time and speaking to me. Is there anything you'd like to point my listeners towards before I let you get back to your day?
No. Well, actually, I suppose I always plug my social media during interviews like this. So as I said, I'm Wilfred Reilly, WILFRED REILLY. On Facebook, I have a personal page, fan page. Wilfred Reilly on YouTube. I am Will_BEEST 630 on Twitter. So I'm at that level of semi-fame where if you want to come argue with me or ask me to go get a beer, I actually might do it. I'll probably engage you. So I look forward to talking to people. Enjoyed talking to you, man.
You too. Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation, produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener-supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?